The vultures were circling long before the heart stops beating. They see an old man, a house full of memories they called junk, and a walking, talking inheritance. They mistook my silence for senility. They mistook my patience for weakness. Every predator makes one fatal mistake. They underestimated their prey, and they never ever thought to check the time on the clocks I build. They were about to learn that my gears grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. This is how I destroyed my son. It began, as these things often do, in the kitchen, the heart of my home, the room that still smelled faintly of Isabelle's cinnamon buns if I closed my eyes tight enough. Julian and his wife Brenda sat at the worn oak table, their smiles as thin and brittle as spun sugar. They had come bearing cheap supermarket flowers and the heavy scent of desperation. I had seen that look before, in the frantic eyes of customers with broken heirlooms they could not afford to fix. They made small talk for precisely 7 minutes. I timed it. I time everything. It is a habit, a comfort. They asked about my health, my garden, the leaky faucet I had already fixed myself. Each question was a carefully placed stepping stone, leading them across the river of pleasantries to the bank of their true purpose. Brenda, always the less subtle of the two, were the first to take the leap. She gestured vaguely towards the living room, her acrylic nails flashing in the afternoon light. "Dad, we were thinking," she began, her voice syrupy sweet. "This big house, all this stuff. It must be so much for you. All this busting." Julian chimed in, nodding eagerly, especially Mom's old things, her collections. He was looking directly at the mahogany display case on the mantelpiece. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was what he thought was Isabelle's life's passion, her collection of antique Swiss timepieces, each one a masterpiece of horology. Or so it appeared to the untrained, greedy eye. I said nothing. I simply stirred my tea, the clink of the spoon against the porcelain the only sound for a long moment. I let the silence stretch, letting it become uncomfortable for them. Not for me. Silence is a tool, you see. In my workshop, it allows me to hear the faintest click of a misplaced gear. In my kitchen, it allowed me to hear the frantic thumping of their avaricious hearts. They wanted me to fill the void, to make it easy for them. I would not. Finally, Julian broke. "Look, Dad, we're in a bit of a bind, a temporary cash flow problem. You know how it is." His words were smooth, practiced. He had probably rehearsed this in the car. Brenda placed a hand on his arm, a theatrical gesture of support. "We have an opportunity, Samuel, a business venture. But we need capital. And those old watches, they just sit there collecting dust. Mom would have wanted to help us." That was the line that did it. Invoking her name, the memory of Isabelle, her worn smile, her genuine love for the art in each tiny machine, flashed in my mind. She would have been heartbroken. She had despised their reckless spending, their insatiable need for more, their hollowness. Using her memory as a tool to pry her treasures from her home, from me, was a desecration. A cold, quiet fury, as precise and sharp as a watchmaker's scalpel, settled deep within my chest. But my face remained a placid mask of elderly confusion. I feigned ignorance, a role they had long since assigned to me. Watches? Oh, those old things. They are just sentimental trinkets, my boy, worth more to me than anyone else. I tapped my temple. The memories, you know. Their faces fell in unison. The frustration was a flicker in their eyes, quickly extinguished. They had expected a simple transaction, a gentle bullying of a forgetful old man. They were not prepared for the slightest resistance. Their patience, unlike mine, was a shallow pool. Brenda's syrupy tone curdled. "Samuel, please don't be difficult. We know what they're worth. We had a specialist look at some photos. They are worth a fortune that could solve all our problems. My son, my own flesh and blood, could not even look at me." He stared at the display case, his eyes glassy with greed. He had already spent the money in his head 1,000 times over. He saw sports cars and foreign holidays. I saw my Isabelle's life. The pretense shattered completely. Julian stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the linoleum floor. "We are not asking, Dad. We are taking them. We will pay you back, of course, once the deal goes through." He strode into the living room, and his hands I once taught to hold a screwdriver with delicate care, reached for the case. It was a clumsy, brutish gesture, an act of pure violation. And in that moment, the last vestiges of fatherly affection I held for him evaporated like morning mist. I did not shout. I did not rush to stop him. Instead, a strange calm washed over me. The fury in my chest cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a single gleaming point. A plan, intricate and beautiful in its terrible clockwork precision, began to assemble itself in my mind. Every gear, every lever, every spring, clicking perfectly into place. I watched him lift the heavy case from the mantel, his breath coming in ragged, excited gasps. Brenda watched him with the eyes of a starving wolf. I rose slowly from my chair, my movements deliberate. I walked towards him, and for a second he tensed, expecting a fight. It was almost comical. I, an 80-year-old man, against him. But I simply reached out and flicked a speck of dust from the glass of the case he was holding. "Be careful with those, Julian," I said. My voice was even, almost gentle. "They are more delicate than they appear." The double meaning was lost on them entirely. A slow smile spread across my face. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a craftsman who sees the final, perfect design in his mind's eye. The smile confused them. It was not the reaction they had anticipated. They had prepared for tears, for anger, for pleading. They were utterly disarmed by my placid agreement. Julian hesitated, the heavy case in his hands. You're okay with this?" he stammered. I nodded serenely. A son should be able to turn to his father for help. Relief washed over their faces, so potent it was almost sickening. They exchanged a look of triumphant disbelief. "See?" Brenda whispered, a smug little hiss. "I told you he would come around." They saw it as a victory, a capitulation of a weak, old man. They could not comprehend that it was I who had just seized complete and utter control of the situation. They thought they were holding a treasure. They were holding the bait, and the trap had just been sprung, its steel jaws closing silently around them. They less quickly after that, a clumsy exit fueled by their eagerness to convert their prize into cash. They offered hollow promises to visit soon, to call, to pay me back tenfold. I waved from the doorway, maintaining my serene, slightly vacant smile, until their expensive card disappeared around the corner. Then, and only then, did I close the door. The click of the lock echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the empty house. I was alone. The game had begun. I walked back into the living room and stood before the empty space on the mantelpiece. For 2 years, since Isabelle had passed, that case had been a source of quiet comfort. Now its absence was a gaping wound, but I felt no grief, only a cold, thrilling sense of purpose. I went to the small portrait of Isabelle on the side table. Her eyes seemed to sparkle with a silent, shared understanding. "This is for you, my love," I whispered to the silver frame. "For your honor. They will not tarnish your memory." My steps were light as I descended the narrow stairs to my basement workshop. The familiar scent of lubricating oil, old wood, and polished brass filled my lungs. This was my sanctuary, a world of order, logic, and absolute precision. On the walls, tools hung in their designated places. On the benches, half-finished projects and pieces of dismantled clocks lay like sleeping metallic creatures. Here, I was not a frail old man. I was a master of my craft, a creator and a controller of time itself. The first phase of my plan was communication. I needed an ally, someone who understood the value of history and legacy. I picked up the old rotary phone on my workbench and dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone on the other end rang 3 times before a familiar, cultured voice answered. "Arthur, it's Samuel. I have a rather interesting proposition for you regarding a donation to the museum. A permanent exhibition, perhaps. The Isabelle Dubois Horological Collection." Arthur Prescott was the chief curator of the city's historical museum and a dear old friend. We had spent countless hours discussing the finer points of escapement mechanisms and the genius of long-dead artisans. He was a man who understood that some things were beyond monetary value. He listened patiently as I laid out the groundwork of my request, omitting the sordid details about Julian and Brenda. I simply told him I was planning for my estate and wished for Isabelle's collection to be shared with the world. "Of course, Samuel. We would be honored." Arthur's voice was filled with genuine excitement. "When can I see them? They will need to be authenticated and cataloged." His words were a soothing balm. Authentication, cataloging, the official, meticulous process of preservation. It was the antithesis of Julian's crude smash and grab. "I will bring them to you myself," I replied. "Very soon. First, there are a few arrangements I need to make. A few gears that need to be set in motion." After the call, I turned to a large, locked safe in the corner of the workshop, hidden behind a stack of horology journals. I spun the dial. The familiar clicks, a tiny symphony of security. Inside, on shelves of cedar wood, lay the real collection, not the one Julian had stolen. This was Isabelle's true legacy. Each piece was pristine, maintained with a lover's care. Their ticking was a gentle chorus, a heartbeat of history that only I could hear. The watches Julian took were my own creations. For years, as a way to hone my skills, I had been creating replicas. Not forgeries intended to deceive, but studies in craftsmanship. I would replicate the masterworks of old, down to the smallest detail, the most intricate engraving. They were perfect on the outside, a flawless imitation. But inside, their movements were standard, their materials inferior. They were beautiful, intricate, and ultimately almost worthless shells. These were the watches now in my son's possession. Next, I knew they would first seek a preliminary appraisal to satisfy their loan sharks. I made a quiet call to a pawnbroker I knew, a man named Silas, who owed me a favor from long ago. I described the replicas, and I described my son. I told Silas to expect him, to praise the watches, and to give him a valuation so absurdly high it would make his head spin. Silas, who had his own distaste for predators, agreed with a low chuckle. Greed, he said, is a wonderful lubricant for a trap. Text. The next part of his call was predictable. There's a TV show, Dad, Treasure Finders. They're in town next week. We are going to take them on the show. The appraiser there is world famous. The publicity will make them even more valuable. Imagine it. The Dubois collection, rediscovered. He spoke of it as if it were already his, the name Dubois just a brand. The memory of my Isabelle, the woman who had assembled it piece by loving piece, had been completely erased. That sounds like a grand idea, Julian, I said. My voice as smooth as polished steel. You must let me know when it is on. I would love to watch. This sealed it for them. My apparent blessing, my senile pride in their success, removed any lingering shred of doubt they might have had. They were so sure of their victory, so blinded by the glittering prize, that they could not see the precipice just a few steps ahead. The stage was now perfectly set for their grand finale. The days leading up to the show were quiet, too quiet. I knew Julian and Brenda were living in a fantasy, spending money they did not have, making promises to dangerous people based on the value of my replicas. Their loan sharks would be growing impatient. The pressure on them would be immense, and when desperate people feel pressure, they make mistakes. They become sloppy. They push too hard. I was simply waiting for the next inevitable move from their side of the board. It came on a Tuesday evening. A heavy knock on my front door that was not the friendly wrath of a neighbor. I looked through the peephole and saw two large men in cheap suits. They looked uncomfortable and impatient. They were not here to sell me anything. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain latched. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice intentionally frail. The larger of the two men leaned forward, his presence filling the small space. "Samuel Dubois?" he grunted. "We have a message from Julian. He seems to think you might be holding out on him. He thinks the old lady might have had another collection, a private one. He says you should be more cooperative." His eyes scanned the inside of my house, a crude and invasive inspection. The threat was clear, hanging in the air between us like a foul odor. They were not here to persuade me. They were here to intimidate, to frighten the old man into revealing more treasure. I felt a flicker of actual fear then, a cold knot in my stomach. They were larger and younger than me. But then I looked past them, at the rose bushes Isabelle had planted, and my resolve returned, colder and harder than before. His was a new level of depravity. To steal from me was one thing. To send thugs to my home, to the sanctuary I had shared with my wife, was another. They had crossed a line from which there was no return. This would only make their fall that much more spectacular. I summoned the best performance of my life. I let my hand tremble on the door. I widened my eyes in fear and confusion. "More?" I stammered. "There is nothing more. That was everything. Please, I just want to be left alone." My apparent terror seemed to satisfy them. The big man grunted again. "Just be smart, old man. Julian's friends are not patient people." They turned and walked away, their heavy footsteps echoing down the path. I closed the door, my heart hammering not from fear, but from adrenaline. Their little visit confirmed my suspicions. The loan sharks were closing in. Julian and Brenda were not just greedy, they were terrified. The television appearance was no longer just about publicity and ego. It was their last, desperate gamble to get the money they owed before their time ran out. They were walking a tightrope over a canyon, and I was patiently waiting at the other end with a pair of shears. Their desperation had made them predictable, and their predictability made them vulnerable. I spent the next day making my final preparations. I met with Arthur at the museum, and with the help of his staff, we carefully packed the real collection. Each timepiece was placed in a custom acid-free container. We drafted the donation paperwork, a legal document that transferred ownership of the entire Isabelle Dubois horological collection to the museum, effective 1 year ago. I backdated the document, and Arthur, my loyal friend, notarized it without question. It was a secret between us. With the real watches safe and the legal framework in place, all that was left was the performance. I contacted the producers of Treasure Finders. I told them I was the father of a guest, Julien Dubois, who was bringing in a collection of watches. I told them a charming, slightly embellished story about my life as a watchmaker and my late wife's passion. I hinted that I had a small surprise of my own for the show. Intrigued, they promised me a seat in the front row. The pieces were all in place. The day of the show arrived, bright and garish. The convention center buzzed with a nervous energy, a marketplace of hope and history. I found my seat in the front row, a quiet gray figure in a sea of eager faces. When Julian and Brenda were called to the stage, they were beaming. Brenda wore a dress that was too tight and too expensive, and Julian had the slick, confident air of a man who believed he had already won the lottery. They carried the display case like a holy relic. The appraiser, a man named Alistair Finch with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted them with professional warmth. He was renowned for his keen eye and unflappable demeanor. He listened as Julian spun a tale of a long-lost family heirloom, a story polished to a high sheen with lies. My son, the storyteller. He conveniently omitted the part about how he had acquired the collection just a week prior. He presented himself as a dutiful son, the guardian of his mother's legacy. The irony was suffocating. Alistair opened the case with reverent hands. "Ah, yes," he murmured, his eyes scanning the watches. "The Dubois collection. I have heard whispers of it for years. A truly remarkable assemblage." Julian and Brenda exchanged a smug glance. The camera zoomed in on their triumphant faces. They were on top of the world, basking in the glow of the studio lights and the validation of a world-renowned expert. The audience murmured in awe. The trap was closing, and they were smiling as it did. The casework, the dial, the finishing. It is a perfect representation of the period, a work of art. Brenda practically vibrated with glee. She squeezed Julian's arm, her painted nails digging into his sleeve. This was it, the moment their lives would change forever. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. He examined a second, then a third, his brow furrowed slightly. He held one up to his ear, listening intently. A long, drawn-out silence filled the studio. It stretched for an eternity. The smiles on Julian and Brenda's faces began to waver. They looked at each other, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. The audience leaned forward, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The professional warmth had vanished from Alistair's face, replaced by a look of intense, scholarly concentration. He knew. Finally, Alistair Finch put the watch down and looked directly at them. The spectacles could not hide the pity in his eyes. "As I said, the craftsmanship is remarkable. In fact, it is too remarkable. It is the work of a single master craftsman, not a collection assembled over decades." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "These are, without a doubt, the finest replicas I have ever seen in my 40-year career. But they are replicas nonetheless, worth a few $100s for the parts, perhaps, but not millions." The silence in the studio was absolute, a vacuum where all the air had been sucked out. Then a strangled gasp from Brenda. The camera zoomed in on her face, a mask of disbelief crumbling into raw fury. "Replicas? What are you talking about? You are wrong. You are an idiot!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. Julian stood frozen, his face ashen. The color had drained from him, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. In a way, he had, the ghost of his fortune. "This is a joke, a publicity stunt." Julian finally found his voice, shouting at Alistair. "Our expert appraised these for millions." He looked wildly around, desperate for someone to validate his fantasy. This is when the host, sensing television gold, turned to the audience. "Is there anyone here who can shed some light on this?" The producer gave me a subtle nod. It was my cue. Slowly, deliberately, I stood up. All cameras swung to me. A quiet old man in a worn sweater. "I am the craftsman," I said. My voice, amplified by a stagehand's microphone, was calm and clear. It cut through the chaos like a diamond blade through glass. I made those watches, every single one of them. They were my practice pieces, a study in the art form my wife so loved. A hush fell over the crowd. Julian and Brenda stared at me, their mouths agape. It was a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. The gears of their minds were grinding, trying to process a reality they could not accept. But, but why? Julian stammered, his voice a pathetic whimper. His entire world was collapsing in on him, live, in front of millions of viewers. Because I knew you would come for them one day, son, I said, my voice softening with a sorrow that was, to my surprise, genuine. I knew you would not be able to resist. The real collection, Isabelle's true legacy, was far too precious to be left in the hands of people who would trade it for a fleeting thrill. A host, a man with a keen sense for drama, stepped forward. The real collection? Mr. Dubois, are you saying the real collection still exists? I smiled, a real smile this time. It exists, and it is safe. In fact, it has been safe for over a year. I donated the entire authentic Isabelle Dubois horological collection to the city museum. It is their property now, a gift to the people of this city, to be cherished and admired forever, a final act of love in my wife's name. As if on cue, the large screen behind the stage flickered to life. It showed a live feed of my old friend Arthur Prescott, standing in a brightly lit gallery at the museum. Behind him, gleaming under spotlights in a state-of-the-art display, was the real collection. Each piece was a marvel, ticking away history. Good evening, Arthur said, his voice resonating with authority. I can confirm that the museum took possession of this priceless collection from Mr. Samuel Dubois last year. It is one of our greatest treasures. That was the final, devastating blow. The truth, undeniable and publicly broadcast. Brenda let out a guttural scream and collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically. Julian simply stood there, a hollowed-out man, his eyes vacant. The loan sharks he owed, undoubtedly watching, now knew their collateral was worthless. The millions he had promised them were a fantasy. In that moment, he was not just broke, he was a dead man walking. His greed had led him to a public execution of his own making. The show cut to a commercial break amidst the chaos. Security guards gently escorted my son and his wife off the stage. I watched them go, two broken figures swallowed by the shadows of the wings. I felt no triumph, no elation, just a profound, weary sadness. I had protected Isabelle's legacy, but I had lost my son long before this night. This was merely the formal burial of a relationship that had died years ago from neglect and avarice. The clock had finally struck midnight on their gilded cage. In the days that followed, the story was everywhere. The clip of Brenda's meltdown went viral. They were publicly shamed, the villains in a story of elderly wisdom triumphing over youthful greed. Their friends deserted them. Their credit was cut off. The lavish lifestyle they had built on a foundation of debt and lies crumbled to dust. The wolves they had borrowed from came to collect. I heard they lost everything. The car, the rented mansion, their reputations. They simply vanished. I did as I had planned. I sold the large family house, a place now haunted by too many memories, both good and bad. It was a relief to let it go, to release the ghosts of what was and what could have been. The proceeds were more than enough for my needs. I did not require much. I kept my tools, my workbench, and the small portrait of Isabelle. These were the only treasures that truly mattered. Everything else was just stuff. The clutter of a life that was ready for a simpler final chapter. Text. One afternoon, there was a tentative knock on my new door. I opened it to find a young woman standing there, my granddaughter Lily, Julian and Brenda's daughter. I had not seen her in years. Her parents had kept her away, filling her head with who knows what. She looked nervous, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. I saw you on the news, Grandpa, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. There were tears in her eyes. In her, I saw none of her parents' greed. I saw a glimmer of Isabelle's kindness, of her gentle spirit. I did not say much. I simply stood aside and gestured for her to come in. I made her a cup of tea, the way Isabelle used to. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunlight stream through the window. It was not a grand reunion, no dramatic reconciliation. It was just a quiet beginning. A single, hopeful tick in the great clock of life, signaling that something new might start. She started visiting every Sunday. She would watch me work, asking questions about the gears and springs. She had her grandmother's eye for detail, her grandfather's steady hands. I started teaching her just as I had once tried to teach your father. She listened. She learned. Our relationship was not built on obligation or inheritance, but on shared time and quiet respect. It was a foundation built on solid ground, not the shifting sands of want and need. Sometimes I visit the museum. I stand before the Isabelle Dubois collection and watch as people gaze in wonder at the tiny, intricate machines she so adored. They see the beauty in the history. They read the plaque dedicating it to her memory. Her legacy is not just preserved, it is celebrated. It is shared. It belongs to everyone now, safe from the grasping hands of greed. In that, I find my ultimate vindication. It was never about the money. It was about respect. Julian and Brenda became a cautionary tale whispered at family gatherings. I heard rumors they had fled the state, buried under a mountain of debt they could never repay, chased by shadows of their own making. I do not know for sure, and I find that I do not care to know. They chose their path. They wound their own springs so tightly that they were bound to break. Justice, like a well-made clock, is often just a matter of time running its natural course. My life is small now, and infinitely richer for it. It is measured not in possessions, but in peaceful mornings, in the satisfaction of a job well done, in the shared laughter with my granddaughter. I have learned that family is not just about blood. It is about who shows up. It is about who respects your past and wants to be a part of your future. It is about who sees the person, not the property. I look at Isabelle's portrait on my workbench. Her smile seems to approve. We'd built a good life, she and I. A life based on love and passion and the quiet dignity of hard work. I defended that life. I protected her memory. The predators came, and they found the old lion was not quite toothless yet. They mistook my patience for weakness, my silence for senility. They learned, too late, that a watchmaker knows a secret that the greedy never learn. They learned that everything has a breaking point, and that time, in the end, is the ultimate arbiter of all debts. It exposes all fakes, rights all wrongs, and reveals the true value of things. My son and his wife thought they were stealing a treasure. What they truly stole was their own future, and in the end, they were left with nothing but a handful of beautifully crafted, worthless beers. They had the watches, but I had the time. Looking back, I feel a strange serenity. The anger has faded, replaced by a clarity as clean as a newly polished crystal. Revenge was not the goal, but the mechanism. The goal was preservation. The goal was honor. I set a trap not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to protect the last pure thing I had left of her. The world sees a cunning old man who outsmarted his greedy children. But I know the truth. I was just a husband, keeping a final promise to his wife. Lily brought me a small broken music box last week. She found it at a flea market. It's pretty, she said, but it does not play. Can we fix it, Grandpa? I looked at the delicate, silent mechanism, a puzzle of interlocking parts. I smiled and nodded, pulling my loop over my eye. Yes, I said, I think we can. Together, we can make it sing again. And in that simple act, I found a harmony far more valuable than any Swiss antique. The cycle of creation and repair continues. The hands on the clock face keep moving forward, relentlessly, impartially. Some lives, like poorly made timepieces, run down and stop, their mainsprings broken by misuse and neglect. Others, built with care and maintained with love, can tick on for generations, their chimes marking the passage of a legacy. I choose to focus on the ones that keep ticking, the ones worth saving. Text. The house is sold. The collection is safe. The villains of my story have been vanquished, not by a grand act of violence, but by the quiet, inexorable turning of a well-laid plan. The resolution is not loud. It is the peaceful silence after a storm, the gentle hum of a workshop where everything is in its right place. There is a rightness to it, a balance restored, as if a great cosmic clock has been set right again. My revenge was a timepiece of my own design. The inciting incident was the winding of the spring. The planning was the careful assembly of the gears. The confrontation on live television was the moment the escapement released, letting the stored energy unleash itself in a controlled, dramatic display. And now in the aftermath, I can hear the gentle, steady ticking of a life put back in order. A life of peace. A life lived on my own terms. Lily is getting quite good with the tweezers. She has a natural feel for the work. Yesterday, she successfully repaired the escapement on an old carriage clock. The pride in her eyes was brighter than any jewel. It was the pride of creation, of understanding, of patience rewarded. In her, I see the future. I see Isabelle's legacy living on, not behind museum glass, but in hands that create and hearts that understand. People still talk about the Treasure Finders episode. They call me a genius, a hero. They do not understand. I am just a watchmaker. I see the world as a series of interconnected movements. You apply pressure here, a gear turns there. You remove a key component, and a whole grand facade grinds to a halt. It is not genius. It is simply understanding how things work, especially things like greed and desperation. So here I sit, in my quiet apartment, the evening sun casting long shadows across my workbench. The scent of oil and old brass is my comfort. The ticking of a dozen clocks is my symphony. I protected what was precious. I pruned what was rotten. And I am nurturing what is new and hopeful. I did not get my family back, not the one I had, but I am building a new one, piece by tiny, precious piece. I pick up the portrait of Isabelle one last time. I did right by you, my love, I whisper. The painted eyes seem to smile. My story is not about the grand triumph of revenge, but the quiet defense of love and memory. They thought they could take my past, but in the end, I secured my future. And for an old man at the end of his days, that is all the treasure one could ever need. The clock ticks on.